Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we'll be covering how to write a strength and conditioning program for athletes. The first thing to establish is what athletic qualities can be trained that can benefit physical performance for an athlete. We have several components that can be trained using strength and conditioning training. We will now briefly cover each of these qualities. The first is linear speed. This refers to how fast an athlete can run in a straight line. This includes both acceleration ability as well as maximum speed running. We also have change of direction ability. This refers to how quickly an athlete can decelerate, turn in a different direction, and then re-accelerate in that direction. Reactive power is the next quality, which refers to the ability to produce high forces in very short times. The stretch shortening cycle plays a large role in this quality, allowing efficient force transfer through the use of elastic energy. The next quality is traditional power. This refers to moving moderate to heavy loads as fast as possible. This is similar to reactive power, although loads used are much heavier, therefore the speed of movement is much slower. Maximal strength is the next quality, which simply refers to maximum force production. Another trainable quality is hypertrophy, which refers to muscle growth. Some athletes may seek to enhance muscle size for their sport. And lastly, we can also include metabolic conditioning or endurance training. This refers to improving the repeatability of an exercise. Now that we've discussed what potential physical qualities we can train with strength and conditioning training, we now need to establish what qualities will actually be beneficial to train for a specific athlete. Let's take the example of a generic rugby player and establish what qualities they will need to train. Linear speed is important for most positions to both beat defenders and to also chase attackers. Change of direction is important since players often need to run in different directions based on the run of the game. Reactive power is important for most positions as it will help with maximal velocity running. Traditional loaded power is also important since it will help speed and acceleration, and players often need to overcome the resistance of their opponents during tackles. Maximal strength is important for overall robustness and its benefits for all other qualities. Hypertrophy may be important for most players since a bigger body is generally better for tackles, and it can also be helpful to build up susceptible areas that are prone to injury. And lastly, endurance training is also important to ensure high intensity efforts are able to be repeated throughout the entire match. If we now take the example of a volleyball player, the qualities they require may look slightly different. Linear speed, hypertrophy, or endurance will hardly be beneficial for the physical performance of a volleyball athlete. However, change of direction training may be useful as volleyball athletes are frequently stepping in different directions based on the run of the gameplay. Reactive power is probably useful for repeated jumps or running jumps. Loaded power will enhance vertical jump performance, and maximal strength will enhance all other qualities and provide robustness to the athlete. So each athlete or team should be trained based on which qualities they require in their sport. Let's use the example of this rugby player that we discussed and write a program for them throughout this video. So for the rugby athlete, although every quality is important for their training, change of direction and endurance training will be performed frequently enough during sport practice that it doesn't need to be specifically trained during strength and conditioning sessions. Therefore, for this example, we are only going to include linear speed, reactive power, traditional loaded power, maximum strength, and hypertrophy training. Now that we know what qualities we will be targeting, the next consideration is how the program will be structured. First and foremost, we need to establish how many overloading versus deloading weeks we are going to employ. Generally speaking, anywhere between 2 to 6 weeks of overloading training can be implemented before a deload week. More advanced athletes will generally require deloads more frequently and may veer towards the lower end of these recommendations, while less experienced athletes may be able to handle more overloading training before a deload week is implemented. For our example rugby player, we're going to implement a 4-to-1 overload to deload week ratio, meaning that 4 weeks of overloading training will be employed before a 1-week deload. The next factor to plan for our program structure is what order the training qualities will be performed in. As a general rule, the following order is recommended. First, linear speed training, next, change of direction, then reactive power, loaded power, max strength, hypertrophy, and endurance training last. This order is recommended since the first qualities on this list are the most fatigue sensitive, while the last qualities are the least fatigue sensitive. For example, very small levels of fatigue will significantly impact linear speed, while an adequate training stimulus can still be achieved for hypertrophy or endurance training, even with moderate levels of fatigue. So for our rugby player example, we will order our sessions by performing linear speed first, reactive power second, loaded power third, max strength fourth, and hypertrophy last. The next stage in writing a program is to select exercises for each of the qualities that will be trained. The exercise selection will be based on numerous factors such as training age, time of year, and individual injuries. Athletes with more experience in strength and conditioning training can use more advanced exercises than an athlete who has never been in a weight room. Furthermore, an experienced athlete may not get enough stimulus from a certain exercise to improve performance, while almost any exercise will work for a novice. For example, an experienced athlete may be able to perform back squats as a strength exercise, while a novice may be better off doing walking lunges, since they may not be able to perform a back squat with safe and effective technique. The time of year also dictates what exercises will be selected. Certain times of the year may be very intense during the sport practice for the athletes, and strength and conditioning exercises may need to be less intense to avoid injury. During the middle of the season, or toward the end of a long season, we may want to implement more joint-friendly exercises to reduce the risk of joint pain and injury. For example, we may select box jumps as a power exercise rather than squat jumps to reduce the eccentric loading on the hips, knees, and ankles. And lastly, exercise selection may need to alter based on individual anatomy and injuries. Some athletes simply find certain exercises to be irritating on the joints, while other exercises aren't. Obviously, in this case, the exercises should be changed to something that the athlete can perform safely. For example, it is common that athletes have shoulder issues during the barbell bench press. This can be changed to a dumbbell bench press or weighted dips as an alternative exercise, and will achieve essentially the same adaptations. Also, athletes may prefer certain exercises over others, and are therefore likely to put in more effort. So if the program allows, an athlete's preferences should be preferred over exercises they dislike. Let's now select some exercises for our example rugby player. For linear speed training, we've implemented rolling sprints and resisted sprints. This covers both top speed running and specific acceleration training. For reactive power training, we've chosen hurdle jumps as a plyometric exercise. For traditional loaded power training, the trap bar jump was selected. Strength training consists of box squats and bench press, and hypertrophy training includes dumbbell rows, stiff leg deadlifts, and lateral neck raises for injury prevention. And the last programming consideration is what method of progression will be employed for the training block. We will now cover the best way to progress each quality over time. The method of progression will always follow a general to specific model, meaning that the quality will become more specific as it progresses. Let's first start with linear speed training. Linear speed training should be progressed via increasing the distance of the sprints. This is because the longer the distance is, the faster the speed the athlete can run, up to a certain point that is. So sprint training should start with short distance sprints of around 10 meters and increase over time up to around 60 meters or longer. This should be progressed in small increments each week of only 2.5 to 5 meters to allow the tissues to adapt to the stress. If resisted sprints are also implemented for acceleration training, this should also follow a similar progression. However, distances may only need to be progressed up to around 30 meters rather than 60 meters. Also, resisted sprints should start with heavier loads and decrease the loads over time to allow faster running speeds. Change of direction training will be performed so frequently during sport practice that the only real variable we can manipulate is the volume. However, if additional change of direction work will be performed during the strength and conditioning sessions, then it can be progressed in a slightly different way. The best way would be to start with larger change of direction angles and progress to smaller angles. For example, we may start with 90-degree cuts and slowly progress until full 180-degree turns are performed. Furthermore, the speed of the approach can be increased. If the athlete runs faster into a turn, there will be more inertia to overcome and more eccentric force required to decelerate. Reactive strength should be progressed via decreasing the contact times over time. This is because we ultimately want this type of training to transfer to running and jumping performance, which will have very short ground contact times. This can be done by manipulating the exercises performed and also the external load used. For example, weighted depth jumps may be performed early in the program, where the goal is to jump as high as possible. This could then progress to unloaded hurdle jumps, where the goal is to minimize ground contact time. Loaded power training should follow a very similar model of progression. Load should start heavier, which also means slower movement velocity, and progress to lighter loads with faster velocities. Maximal strength should follow a linear type periodization model. This means that higher volumes and lighter weights are used earlier in the program, and this progresses to heavier loads with lower volumes. This is a logical progression to follow, since maximal force production is the goal, which is best achieved by lifting the heaviest loads possible. Hypertrophy training may not have a particular periodization model to follow, as it is a structural adaptation rather than a neural adaptation. Therefore, the method of progression employed probably won't change from block to block, although the week-to-week progression is still important. Generally, hypertrophy training is best achieved by using multiple sets of 6 reps or greater and taken fairly close to failure. This can then be progressed by increasing the number of reps performed, increasing the load lifted, or increasing the number of sets performed. And endurance training will likely be performed primarily by manipulating sport practice sessions, rather than separate conditioning sessions. However, additional running may be implemented at certain times throughout the year if the players aren't getting enough conditioning training from the sport. Therefore, we can progress this by starting with longer distance, lower intensity running, and progress to higher intensity, shorter distance running. For example, we may start with slower continuous running for longer distances and progress to short interval sprints with limited recovery between efforts. Let's now implement these methods of progression into our rugby player program example. For a 15-week program, the first 5 weeks may look something like this. We can see here that the linear speed exercises are progressed by increasing the distances each week. We can also see that the resisted sprints use a heavy load, which will mean more force production but slower running speeds. For reactive power, depth jumps were chosen where the goal is maximal jump height, and additional weight will be used. This will mean fairly long ground contact times, but high force production. This is progressed by adding an additional rep to each set each week. For a loaded power exercise, the trap bar jump was chosen. As we can see here, the sets and reps stay the same, although the load used decreases. This will mean that greater jump height and faster movement velocities will be expected week to week. For strength training, the box squat and bench press were selected. The progression here is that weight remains the same, while the sets and reps increase over the weeks as a method of increasing volume. And lastly, we have hypertrophy training, where stiff leg deadlifts, dumbbell rows, and neck raises for injury prevention have been implemented. I've just shown a different method of progression for each 5-week block to give some examples. In this block, the reps and weight remain the same, while the number of sets increases each week. In the second block, the training is progressed again to be slightly more specific. For our linear speed, the distances increase week to week as per the last block, although they start at a longer distance and progress even further. Also, the resisted sprints now use a moderate load rather than a heavy load, meaning that running speeds will be slightly faster. Reactive power now uses hurdle jumps rather than depth jumps, where the focus is on minimal ground contact time. However, an additional 5 kilos has been chosen, which will slightly increase contact times and also increase force production. Once again, the number of reps performed increases each week. The trap bar jump is still used for loaded power, and the same model of progression is employed. However, this time the load is decreased even more from the last block, meaning that velocity will be even faster. Strength training now uses lower reps with heavier loads, and we can see here that the number of sets and reps remains the same, while the load is increased slightly each week. And the next hypertrophy example follows a progression of increasing the number of reps performed each week, while the sets and load remains the same. In this example, 1 extra rep is performed over the 3 sets each week. And now the last 5-week block of the program may look something like this. Once again, the distances of the sprints are increased each week to even further distances again. The resisted sprints now use light loads to allow faster running speeds. Hurdle jumps are still used as a reactive power exercise, although this time no additional load is used. This will decrease ground contact times and be most specific to sprinting and jumping performance. The trap bar jump follows the same progression model, although the loads decrease even further again, allowing even greater jump heights. Strength training now has the same method of increasing the load each week, although the number of sets performed also decreases. Also, only sets of 1 rep are being performed as this allows the highest force production. And lastly, hypertrophy training follows a method of increasing load over time. This is possible with heavier compound lifts like the stiff leg deadlift, although exercises which use lighter loads will be very difficult to increase load each week. Therefore, loads may have to be increased less frequently, and when they do increase, lower reps may need to be employed. As we can see for the dumbbell row and neck raise, the load increases in week 3 and the reps decrease. Then in week 4, the reps increase with the new heavier load. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.